Desmond, I need your signature on this before end of shift.
I've read it.
Then you know what it does. Sign it. That's what we pay you for.
I can't sign this.
You have a son, a mortgage, one income. Think carefully about what you're doing.
I've already thought about it.
Do as I say, or quit!
In a glass-walled control room at the center of the factory floor, 40 workers watched through the windows as their CEO handed their manager a document and waited. They couldn't hear what was said. What they saw was Lenora Pierce composed certain delivering what she believed was an airtight ultimatum to a man she had carefully chosen. She had studied Desmond Brooks. She knew his income, his mortgage, his son. She believed that made him controllable. So when he closed his laptop and walked out without a single word, what had Lenora Pierce actually set in motion? If you've ever watched someone in power assume they already know what a person will do under pressure and been wrong, this story is for you. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the rest of it. Desmond Brooks ran his production line the way some men ran their households, not through authority, but through presence. He knew which workers took the early shift because their kids had school drop-off, which ones had been covering extra hours since Marcus's wife started chemotherapy, and which ones were 3 months behind on a mortgage they never should have taken. He didn't know these things because he asked. He knew them because he showed up every day and paid attention. And over 11 years, the 40 men and women on his line had learned that Desmond noticed things that other managers walked past without blinking. That kind of attention created a particular kind of loyalty. His workers didn't trust him because he had power over them. They trusted him because he had never once asked them to do something he wouldn't do himself. When a night shift ran long, Desmond stayed. When a piece of equipment failed and the floor needed to be reconfigured before morning, he was the first one down there with a wrench and a flashlight. The line ran well because the people on it believed the man in charge had the same stake in it they did. He carried that same steadiness home, though home looked nothing like what his income should have allowed. Desmond and his 13-year-old son Caleb lived in a small house in a quiet neighborhood, drove a pickup truck with well over 200,000 miles on it, and ate dinners that Desmond cooked from scratch every night of the week. When something broke, Desmond fixed it. When something wore out, he used it until it couldn't be used anymore. Vacations, when they happened at all, were drives to a state park 2 hours away. Caleb had grown up watching other families upgrade their phones every year and take trips to places with airports. He had grown up wondering what was wrong with theirs. He never asked his father directly, but Caleb was 13, which meant he had started doing the math himself. And some mornings when Desmond pulled up to the school in that aging truck, Caleb would scan the drop-off line before opening the door, measuring the distance between what their life looked like and what the other families seemed to take for granted. Desmond noticed that too. He noticed everything. And he said nothing because the answer wasn't something he could explain to a 13-year-old in a school parking lot. Lenora Pierce had built her career on reading people quickly and accurately. She could walk into a room and identify within minutes who could be moved and who couldn't, who had leverage and who was exposed. It was a skill she'd sharpened over 2 decades in operations management, and she had rarely been wrong. When she turned that particular skill toward Desmond Brooks, she saw what the numbers told her: 1 income stream, 1 dependent, 1 mortgage, no visible financial cushion, and a lifestyle that signaled a man running close to the edge. She had reviewed his salary records, checked the property tax filings on his house, noted the age and make of his vehicle. Everything pointed to the same conclusion: Desmond Brooks was a man who could not afford to lose this job. What Lenora needed done required someone specific. The company had made the decision to close a section of the production line and eliminate 40 positions. That decision was already final. But Lenora had identified an additional opportunity inside that decision, one that required careful handling. Most of those 40 workers were approaching a seniority milestone that would trigger a significant package of retirement benefits and long-term compensation. They had been building toward that threshold for nearly a decade. If the layoffs proceeded on the original timeline, the majority of them would cross that threshold and receive everything they'd earned. But if the termination date was moved up by just a few weeks, none of that would vest. The company stood to save millions of dollars in a single adjustment. The adjustment itself was simple. What wasn't simple was making it look like something other than what it was. If the change came directly from the executive office, it would invite scrutiny from the workers, from their contacts, from anyone paying attention to the timing. But if the change came through an operational manager who had built the schedule himself, it could be framed as a routine administrative decision, a technical matter, the kind of thing that happened in plant operations all the time. Desmond was the right person for this because he had built the original schedule, because his name carried 11 years of credibility with the workforce, and because Lenora had calculated that having a respected black manager execute the change would provide the company with a layer of protection against any future allegation that leadership had deliberately targeted a vulnerable group of workers. She didn't want just his name on a document. She wanted his reputation, his face, and his history with those 40 people to absorb whatever backlash might follow. Lenora sent the revised termination schedule to Desmond through the internal document system 2 days before the face-to-face meeting flagged for his review and signature. What came back the following morning was not a signature. It was a single line entered into the response field, formal, precise, and unambiguous. He could not confirm a schedule designed to prevent workers from receiving benefits they had legitimately earned. No elaboration, no emotional language. Just a clear record of refusal time-stamped and logged in a system that neither of them controlled. Lenora read that response and made a decision. She called Desmond into the glass-walled control room at the center of the factory floor, where the conversation could be witnessed without being heard. She placed a printed copy of the revised schedule on the table and told him she needed his signature before end of shift. Desmond told her he had already read it. She told him she knew that, and that she needed him to sign it anyway. She reframed the layoffs as an operational matter, used the word administrative more than once, and worked methodically through every argument that might dissolve his objection. Desmond let her finish. Then he said again that he couldn't sign it. That was when Lenora shifted. She mentioned Caleb by name. She mentioned the mortgage and the health insurance that covered both of them and how quickly that coverage would disappear. Her voice didn't rise. She delivered each point the way someone reads from a list with the confidence of a person who had never found the limit of what she could ask. Then she said the 11 words she had said to other people in other rooms across 20 years. Do as I say or quit. Desmond understood exactly where he was standing. He had known a moment like this was possible, not this specific room, not these specific words, but a confrontation with exactly this shape. And he had understood for a long time that how a person responds to a moment like this is almost never decided in the moment itself. It's decided years earlier by choices that look completely unrelated at the time. He also understood that every possible reaction he could give Lenora was already a trap. Anger would give her a narrative about a man who couldn't be managed. Argument would let her reframe his objection as a professional dispute. An appeal to his son would hand her the pressure point she was already pressing. And compliance would put his name on a document designed to take something from 40 people who had trusted him for 11 years. Lenora had built her plan around a man she believed had no room to move. What she had not accounted for was the possibility that Desmond had spent 11 years creating exactly that room. He didn't argue. He didn't appeal. He closed his laptop with both hands, coiled the charging cable, and placed his notebook and the small framed photo of Caleb into the canvas bag he brought to work every day. Then he stood up. Lenora spoke to his back as he crossed the room, told him he didn't have another job waiting, that his son needed to eat, that a mortgage didn't pause because a man decided to have principles. Her voice stayed controlled throughout, informing rather than pleading the way someone describes a weather forecast they had no part in creating. Desmond stopped at the door. He turned and looked at her directly, not with defiance, not with the burning expression of someone who wanted her to understand what this cost him, but with something quieter and harder to read. He nodded once. Then he walked through the door and across the factory floor in full view of the 40 workers on the other side of the glass, and kept walking until he was outside. Lenora stood in the room where she had expected to collect a signature. She had prepared for his anger, for tears, for grudging capitulation. She had not prepared for silence, because silence gave her nothing to use. There was no outburst, to report no desperate plea to recast as instability, no sentence she could bend in a direction that served her. He had given her back nothing, not his name, not a reaction, not a single word that could be used against him. Outside the glass, the workers had watched a scene they couldn't hear. They saw their manager receive something from the CEO, sit still for a moment, then pack his bag and leave while layoff rumors were already moving through the building. They drew the only conclusion: the visual evidence supported Desmond had found out what was coming and had saved himself. They didn't know yet that the man they were about to blame had just chosen to lose everything rather than put his name on something designed to take from them. They couldn't know. All they could see was that he was gone, and Lenora, standing alone in the glass room, was already reaching for her phone. 3 days after Desmond walked out of that glass room, Curtis Vaughn showed up at his front door without calling first. Curtis had worked on Desmond's line for 9 years longer than almost anyone else, and in all that time he had operated on a simple belief that Desmond Brooks was a different kind of man. Not a perfect man, not a man without limits, but a man whose loyalty ran in the same direction as his authority. That belief had made Curtis defend Desmond in break-room arguments, back him in scheduling disputes, and tell newer workers that if Desmond said something, you could count on it. 9 years of that belief was now sitting in Curtis's chest like something spoiled. When Desmond opened the door, Curtis didn't raise his voice. He was too controlled for that, and maybe too tired. He stood on the front step and looked at Desmond the way a person looks at a house that's burned down, not with rage at the fire, but with the grief of someone who had believed the structure was sound. He told Desmond plainly that he had thought he was a different kind of man. Then he said what everyone on the line had concluded, that Desmond had found out what was coming, said nothing, and walked away, clean. Desmond didn't deny it. He didn't pull Curtis inside and walk him through what had happened in that room, didn't describe the document or what Lenora had asked him to do with it. He looked at Curtis and said only that he understood why Curtis thought that. Curtis held his gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked back to his car. Desmond stayed in the doorway until the car was gone, then stepped back inside and stood in the dim hallway without moving to turn on a light. It was the only moment in the days that followed when something in him came close to breaking. Not when Lenora had threatened him, not when he had handed in his badge, but standing in his own house while the sound of Curtis's car faded down the street. He had known it would happen this way. Knowing something in advance doesn't make it easier to carry when it arrives. It just means there is no room to pretend you were surprised. Lenora didn't waste time. Within hours of Desmond's departure, she had identified Gavin Rowe as the alternative. Gavin managed a separate section of the facility and had spent several years positioning himself carefully, attending the right meetings, aligning with the right opinions, making himself visible to the people whose decisions shaped careers. When Lenora placed the same revised termination schedule in front of him, Gavin asked one question before reading to the bottom of the page. He asked whether executing the request would factor positively into his upcoming performance review. Lenora gave him the answer he was looking for, phrased the way such answers always are, not as a promise, but as an implication clear enough that only someone who wanted to misunderstand it could. Gavin signed. The 40 workers on Desmond's former line received their termination notices within days, dated to take effect just before the seniority threshold that would have unlocked their retirement benefits. To anyone reviewing the paperwork without context, it looked like a standard reduction in force. Operational. Unfortunate, but clean. From the outside, Lenora had won. She had the signature, the schedule, and a manager willing to carry the paper trail while she remained at a comfortable distance. The only loose thread was a former manager who had quit rather than cooperate, and a man who walked away without making noise was easy to ignore. What Lenora didn't know, what she had no way of knowing because it was invisible in every financial record she'd reviewed, was that Desmond had spent 11 years building the conditions that made his silence possible. It had started at a different facility in a different city when Caleb was still small enough to carry. Desmond had watched a coworker, a man with 3 kids, a second mortgage, and a car payment he could barely manage sign off on falsified safety data because a supervisor had made it clear that refusing wasn't a real option. The man knew what he was doing was wrong. He talked about it in the parking lot afterward, voice low, eyes on the asphalt. He said he didn't have a choice. And the painful thing, the thing that stayed with Desmond long after he'd left that job, was that the man wasn't entirely wrong. He hadn't signed because he was dishonest. He had signed because he had structured his life in a way that left him no ground to stand on when the moment came. Every obligation stacked on top of another obligation had quietly stripped away the one thing that mattered most when someone in power asked you to do something wrong: the financial ability to refuse and survive what came next. Desmond drove home that night and sat at the kitchen table after Caleb was asleep. What he arrived at wasn't complicated, but it was serious. If a person's ethics were only as strong as their financial margin allowed, then building that margin wasn't just practical, it was moral. It was the slow, unglamorous work of making sure that when someone tried to purchase your integrity, you could afford to leave it off the table. He opened a separate account the following month. He didn't give it an official name. He just thought of it as the Freedom Fund, the money that existed not to be spent, but to make spending unnecessary. Every month, a fixed amount moved into that account before anything else did. The truck stayed old, the house stayed small, the vacations stayed local. When Caleb's friends got new phones, Caleb got an explanation that didn't include the full truth that his father was preparing for a day when someone powerful would try to use their financial vulnerability as a weapon. That was not something a child needed to carry. After 11 years, the account held enough to cover more than a full year of their expenses without a single paycheck coming in. Lenora had looked at Desmond's life and seen a man pinned down by obligation. She had read his truck and his house and his modest habits as evidence of fragility. What she had never considered was that every dollar Desmond hadn't spent was a dollar that belonged to no one but him, a dollar that could not be held over his head, could not be threatened, could not be retracted. She had assessed his weakness through what he owned. She had never thought to measure his strength through what he had chosen not to buy. None of that changed what happened to the 40 workers. They had still lost their jobs. The benefits they had spent nearly a decade building toward were still gone. Gavin's signature was on the document the schedule had been executed, and the company had moved forward as though the whole thing were routine. Desmond's refusal had not stopped the plan. It had only removed his name from it, and in the immediate aftermath, even that felt like a hollow distinction. At home, Caleb watched his father in a new way. He was old enough to understand that something serious had happened, but not old enough to have the full picture, and the gap between those two things made him quiet. The years of the old truck and the skipped vacations had seemed to be leading somewhere. Now they seemed to have led to his father sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings updating a resume and waiting for calls that were slow to come. Desmond applied to other facilities and ran into the same problem quietly and repeatedly. His most recent employment record showed that he had left abruptly following a dispute with executive leadership. Lenora hadn't spoken against him directly. She hadn't needed to. The record spoke in the language hiring managers understood. A black manager who walked out after a confrontation with a CEO was a variable that most operations directors preferred not to introduce. Nobody said that out loud. They just didn't call back. Meanwhile, the workers who'd been let go were doing what people do when they lose something they'd counted on. They were going through their paperwork. Denise, who had worked the line for 8 years, noticed that her termination date sat uncomfortably close to a threshold she had been quietly tracking. She pulled out the documentation from her original hire and compared the dates. Then she called Curtis. Curtis was already angry, and Denise's numbers gave his anger a specific shape. He pulled together every record he could access emails from the scheduling system. The termination notices the benefit schedule that had been distributed during onboarding years earlier. What emerged was a pattern too precise to be coincidence. Every one of them had been let go within the same narrow window that fell just short of the date that would have triggered their long-term benefit package. Then Curtis looked at the actual authorization document and found something that reframed everything he thought he had seen through that glass wall. Desmond's name was not on it. The signature belonged to Gavin Rowe, a manager from a different section of the facility with no operational history on their line. The authorization had been dated within hours of the afternoon Desmond had packed his bag and walked out. Curtis sat with that for a long time. He thought about the way Desmond had looked in the doorway 3 days ago, not defensive, not ashamed, just carrying something quietly. He thought about what Desmond had said, that he understood why Curtis thought what he thought. He thought about what Desmond had not said, which was everything else. And he started to ask himself the question that should have been obvious from the beginning, but that anger had kept him from reaching until now. If Desmond Brooks had left that building to protect himself, why was his name nowhere on the document that did the damage? Curtis brought what he had found to the other workers, and they went through it the way people go through something they are hoping to disprove. Denise pulled the scheduling system records herself and found 2 versions of the same document. One created weeks before the layoffs were announced, one revised and reissued on the same afternoon. Desmond had walked out. The original version had the termination date set after the seniority threshold. The revised version moved it forward by exactly the number of weeks needed to ensure none of them would qualify. Gavin Rowe's name was on the revision time-stamped within hours of Desmond's departure. Then Curtis found the written refusal. It was sitting in the internal document system logged in Desmond's name, 2 days before the face-to-face meeting, a single line, formal and plain, stating that he could not confirm a schedule designed to prevent workers from receiving benefits they had legitimately earned. It wasn't a resignation letter. It wasn't an accusation. It was a quiet record made in plain language by a man who had understood that the most durable form of documentation is a sentence that requires no interpretation. Lenora had needed his signature to make the plan look routine. When he refused and logged that refusal instead, he had done the opposite. He had created a timestamp that showed exactly when the plan existed, exactly what it was designed to do, and exactly who had been asked to authorize it first. When Curtis read that line, the room went quiet. What the record showed taken together was not complicated. Someone at the executive level had decided to move the termination date to cut off the benefits, had needed a trusted name to authorize the change, had been refused by the person they asked, and had then found a replacement willing to sign within the same business day. The plan had not been hidden carefully. It had simply been executed quickly, and speed, it turned out, leaves marks. Curtis drove to Desmond's house a second time. This time he brought 6 of the workers with him. Men and women who had stood on that production line for years, who had watched Desmond through the glass wall and drawn the wrong conclusion, and who were now carrying the weight of that alongside everything else they had lost. They arrived in the early evening and stood on the front step in a loose group the way people stand when they are not entirely sure what they have come to say. Desmond opened the door. Caleb was behind him in the hallway, close enough to hear. Curtis looked at Desmond and began to speak and stopped and tried again. What came out was an apology, not a smooth one, not the kind that costs nothing to say. Curtis told him he had been wrong. He told him that he had gone looking for a reason to be angry and found one that wasn't there. Some of the workers on the step were unable to hold it together entirely, not loudly, just the particular kind of undisguised emotion that surfaces when a person understands too late what someone actually did for them. Then Curtis asked the question that had been sitting with him since he'd first seen that document. He asked why, if Desmond had known he would be blamed, he had still chosen to say nothing. Desmond considered it for a moment, not as though he didn't know the answer, but as though he was deciding how much of it to say out loud. Then he told Curtis that a person cannot do the right thing and also control what other people believe about it. Those are two separate goals, and in the moments that matter most, a person only gets to choose one. He had chosen the first one. Caleb stood in the hallway and watched all of it. He watched Curtis, who had been the loudest voice against his father, standing on their front steps, struggling to get a sentence out. He watched people who had known Desmond for years look at him the way you look at someone when you finally understand what they gave up. It was a lot for a 13-year-old to hold, and he didn't try to sort it out right then. He just stood there and took it in. The documentation went to an employment attorney, then to the company's board of directors, and then to the state labor regulatory office. The board moved faster than anyone expected, which suggested the paper trail was even cleaner than the workers had realized. Within weeks, the company announced it would restore the full benefit package for all 40 affected workers. Gavin Rowe was removed from his position. The official language cited procedural failures, but the meaning was legible to anyone who had followed the sequence of events. Lenora Pierce retained her title at least initially, but the board stripped her of direct authority over personnel decisions and opened an independent review into the termination process. She came to Desmond's house on a Tuesday afternoon unannounced. He let her in without any particular expression of surprise, and they sat at the kitchen table, the same table where years earlier he had made the decision that had changed how he lived. Lenora said she had come because she wanted to understand what she had missed. She told him she had reviewed his salary, his property records, the age of his vehicle, and concluded that he was the most financially exposed person in the building and therefore the least likely to absorb the cost of refusal. She said it the way someone describes a calculation that turned out to be wrong. Desmond told her she had only checked the things he had bought. There was an entire category of information she hadn't seen because it didn't appear in any record, the things he had chosen not to buy year after year for exactly this reason. He told her about the account he'd built over 11 years and about what had motivated it, watching a coworker at an earlier job sign something he knew was wrong because he had no financial ground to stand on. That image had stayed with Desmond long enough to become a decision, and the decision had become a discipline, and the discipline had become the only reason he could sit in a glass room while someone named his son and his mortgage and still push the document back across the table. He told Lenora he hadn't been braver than other people who had complied with her over the years. He had simply been more prepared to absorb what saying no would cost. Lenora listened to all of it. Then she told him she wanted to offer his position back with a higher title and a named increase in compensation. Desmond shook his head. He said a larger salary from the person who had tried to use his financial exposure as leverage was not a better situation. It was the same situation with more zeros attached. He said it without bitterness, the way someone states a mechanical fact about how a thing works. Then he told her what he would accept, not for himself but as the condition of his return. What Desmond asked for was a written policy, not a values statement, not a mission paragraph, but an enforceable document with specific language. The policy would establish that any employee at any level could formally refuse to carry out an instruction they had reasonable grounds to believe was deceptive, unsafe, or unethical, without being terminated, demoted, or retaliated against in any form. Every refusal would be reviewed by an independent committee with no reporting relationship to the manager who had issued the original instruction. The records would be retained and the committee's findings would be binding. Lenora asked him why he wanted this, given that he had clearly been capable of protecting himself without it. Desmond said that was exactly the point. He had been capable because he had 11 years of preparation behind him. Most of the people on his former line hadn't had that. The system Lenora operated within had known that and used it. He wasn't asking the company to restore power to him. He was asking it to give people who didn't have a freedom fund, people who were genuinely one paycheck from a crisis somewhere real to stand when someone tried to purchase their compliance. The board reviewed the proposal and accepted it. The language was incorporated into the company's official operating policy within the following month. The workers on the floor started calling it the Brooks Provision, without anyone organizing the name. It simply emerged the way things are named when the person they're named after never asked for it. Desmond returned to the facility in a newly created role overseeing operational ethics and workforce protection. He no longer reported to Lenora. The reporting structure placed him at a level that gave him direct access to the board's independent review committee, which meant that anyone who came to him with a concern had a clear and protected path forward. On the evening after his first week back, Caleb asked him a question at dinner. He asked whether all of it, the old truck, the house, the years of not doing things other families did, had been preparation for what happened in that glass room. Desmond said yes, in the sense that it was always preparation for a moment like that, even though he hadn't known what the specific moment would look like. He told Caleb that he hadn't withheld things from their life because he didn't want better things for them. He had done it to protect the one thing that money couldn't provide from the outside, the ability to walk away from a room where someone was trying to turn them into people they didn't want to be. A bigger house and a newer truck couldn't give them that. Only the Freedom Fund could. A few weeks later, Caleb's English class was given an assignment asking students to write about the wealthiest person they personally knew. Caleb wrote about his father. He did not mention the account balance or the salary or the new job title. He wrote that his father was the wealthiest person he knew because no one, not a CEO, not a threat delivered in a glass room in front of 40 witnesses, had ever been able to buy his silence, his signature, or his sense of what was right. He wrote that he used to be embarrassed by the truck in the school drop-off line, and that he wasn't anymore. The story ended where it had begun, in the glass-walled control room at the center of the factory floor. Desmond walked through it on a routine morning the same way he walked through every part of the building now without ceremony. The room looked the same. The glass was the same. But on the wall that faced the factory floor, printed and framed in plain black text, was the policy that had not existed before. Anyone standing outside could read it through the glass. It named no one. It protected everyone. The silence that Lenora Pierce had read as surrender had become the loudest thing in the building. There's a version of this story that ends with Desmond losing, and for a while it looked exactly like that. He lost the job. He lost the reputation he had spent 11 years building. He sat at the same kitchen table every night in the same small house, wondering whether what he had refused to do had mattered at all. But here's what the story is actually about. Desmond didn't win because he was exceptional. He won because he had made a decision years before that glass room existed that some things were not for sale. And then he had built his life around protecting that decision quietly without telling anyone 1 month at a time. Most of us are not in a position to do what Desmond did today. But most of us can start doing what Desmond did 11 years ago. Every obligation we don't take on, every expense we don't add every month, we put something aside instead of spending it. Those choices don't just build a bank account. They build the ground beneath your feet for the moment when someone tries to take something from you that isn't theirs. You don't save money just to buy things later. You save it so that when the moment comes, and for most people some version of that moment does come, you have somewhere to stand. If that idea stays with you, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, stories about people who prepared quietly and held the line when it mattered, subscribe and stick around. There are more of them coming, and they're worth your time.